Hello and welcome to First Contact, the world's first podcast where we openly discuss all things relating to humanity's preparation for open contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. I'm your host, Eesha Patel. If you are loving this content, please be sure to join us in the First Contact Facebook community and let us know what you think. Let's dive into another exciting episode of First Contact. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of First Contact. I'm your host, Eesha Patel, and today we have Mark Olly. Now, Mark is a writer, presenter, and an archaeologist, and some of you may recognize him from the latest series of Ancient Aliens. So thank you so much, Mark, for being with us here today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited about this. Now, there's a few things that you are an expert in. Some of your work on Ancient Aliens was related to crop circles. You're also just a UFO researcher, enthusiast, as many of us are. I'd love to know a little bit about your journey of how you got into this and what got you into this whole field of ufology.
Well, okay. Like so many people back in the 1970s, when I was sort of a teenager going into my early 20s, I saw several things in the sky. Being an archaeologist back then, of course, you were outdoors quite a lot. So you tended to spot anything that was flying overhead. And I had at least two episodes where unidentified objects were seen. One in particular was looked like a star moving really quickly across the star field, coming up from the horizon, till it got to the middle, and then it decided it was going to bounce from side to side and then disappear. So that was clearly not anything, of a sort of physical nature. And then fast forward a couple of years, and after a recording session, because I also play drums, I went up to a local high spot here and witnessed quite a famous sighting coming up the River Mersey of this. It's like a bundle of lights, mostly blue and white, but with red. And it came through the steam on a power station. So it's clearly not anything that was around that point in the early 80s. And it came up the Mersey Valley. There were lights going underneath, a bit like you see in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And then when it got sort of opposite me, all the lights went off and it shot up into the sky. So at that point, I became hooked, as it were, on the idea that there's other things out there that we're perhaps not so aware of. Coming into recent times, I suppose I should say, a friend of mine in the early 2000s contacted me, and he said, "You're an archaeologist, aren't you?" I went, "Yeah." He said, "How do you fancy coming and digging up a UFO?" And I'm like, excuse me, like, could you just run
that? To that, can you?
No, could you just run that past me again? Yeah. And he's like, well, there's one near Aberystwyth in Wales, because we have this separate part of the UK called Wales. And he said there's a little village there. And a farmer's contacted me to say he's had this 4 fields covered in debris overnight because something's come down and hit the trees. He said, "Do you want to go and investigate the site?" So I was like, yeah, okay. And then just as a kind of oh, by the way, he said, and we've got half a dozen pieces of the crashed UFO in my garage. And I'm like, seriously, you've got pieces of a UFO? And he's like, yeah. So in 2008, I filmed it. I covered it for my own production company. So we filmed it, and we filmed the UFO fragments that were there at that time. Nobody's come forward since then. Nobody's come and said, yeah, we know what that is. We had a brief analysis done back in the 2000s, and there's duralumin. There's an alloy of duralumin in this metal that was recovered that wasn't actually known at that time. It wasn't possible to be produced. And then a couple of other bits that are attached to it, they couldn't identify. And this is quite a high up lab that did that test for us. So fast forward to now, it's 40 years since the crash, and the publisher I'm with at the moment, Philip Mantle at Flying Disc Press, he's done a couple of books for me. He did one on crystal skulls and human heads, which is the alien skulls, you know, the stretched heads. And then I said, okay, it's my turn. Do one on King Arthur for me. So he produced a King Arthur book, which is glorious. And then he said, well, come on, it's my turn now. He said, do something on UFOs. So I'm like, okay, 40 years since the crash, let's do that. Let's do Europe's Roswell, 40 years since impact. So that's due out pretty much in the next few months, coming up the end of this year. So yeah, I've had, I kind of, incidentally, I've had a lot to do with it without really trying, on archaeological digs. I mean, I had, I was on one in Derbyshire, which is a county not far from here, and we're all settling down for the night, and one of the diggers came running in, and she's like, "Oh, we've just been flown over by a UFO," and most of the people on the site saw this thing come over the top, flew over us, and it wasn't sort of one of ours, and that was fairly common. I mean, I was with that unit for 12 years. So I'd say every other year someone was coming in and saying, we've had a light, or we've been buzzed, or, we've seen a cluster, or whatever. And I live in quite a hot spot here, being that I'm between Liverpool and Manchester. There's a lot of activity in the UK in this area. The Welsh Triangle, the North Welsh Triangle, is where they all pop up, is literally just down the road. I can get there in a few minutes by car. So it's an interesting place to live. So yeah, it's one of those things that's followed me. I've always had an interest in those sort of things, and it's kind of stalked me.
Well, I always say there's a reason for that. Some people are just destined for this work, and it's a conversation I have quite often with a lot of the other speakers on this podcast as well. Now, I know your book is coming out soon, and actually I was talking to Philip just yesterday. He's a really cool guy. Oh, you have it. I love it.
Well, it's got the pre-release. It's got the pre-release strip on it, so that's the pre-release on. But it's going to be great.
What I was going to say is, I would be delighted if you could give us the lowdown, a little sneak preview of what's in the book.
Okay, right.
What can you tell us about your research and some of the exciting things that are in there?
Okay. Obviously, with a situation where you've got pieces of a craft, everybody to a man is going to say, "Show, don't tell." Show me these things. That. Yeah, we need so really. Yeah, that's the main intention of the book. I mean, it's fortunate I've got it handy here, because I can actually go to it's absolutely full of images of the crash debris. That's some of it there. Quite high definition shots as well. So it is illustrated. There's a lot. I can show you some more pieces there. There's a lot of pieces. I was
literally just talking about that hexagonal material today on another interview with someone else that I was recording, and it's quite fascinating how it all links together.
Well, the foil I just showed you, then those two shots, they've just had a piece that looks exactly like that off the Roswell crash sites in New Mexico. So all of a sudden we're doing this, and wham, the big famous, the real Roswell, sort of 1947 crash, they've got a piece of something that looks almost the same as that. So the purpose of the book, for me was that when we produced the documentary back in 2008, obviously that's all singing, all dancing. There's footage of it. It's probably out there somewhere on Amazon Prime. They'll have it. It was an American company that backed that. So that'll be out there somewhere. But with it coming up for 40 years, most people will have, have lost track of the fact that that's out there. So I thought, okay, we'll the story I gave you at the beginning, I thought it's time to tell that as a story. So it starts off with my reasons for being, involved, and then it leads right into the actual story, not just of the crash itself, because there is a newspaper article. We did lots of investigation in 2008, loads of background stuff to that. So it's not just got that. It's then also it goes on to explain how we did the production and where we went and who we spoke to and what that brought up. And then it's a superb opportunity now to sort of bring it all up to date. So we've gone even further. We've gone for freedom of information. We've talked to MOD and various other people to see what's out there. But the two things I would say about the book, which are probably unique, is it is absolutely a serious establishment investigation, because we have the bits. There's no doubt, nothing's CGI'd, nothing's made up. Nobody needs to be hypnotized to find out what happened. It's there. It's physically there. So it's a proper establishment investigation with official people looking at official stuff, and they're all sat there scratching their heads wondering what on earth this is. So that's one of the things that's important to know. And the other thing that's important to know is it does actually have an end. You know, you've got so many books where they say, oh, we leant on this gate and we saw this big thing come whizzing over the trees, and, but we didn't get the camera out quick enough, so we never managed to photograph it. And, we saw a little green man running across the field and he disappeared. And there's no way of actually establishing that any of that is factual. However, this book, as I said, is a show and tell. It's got the pieces, the fragments in there. So if you've got a bookshelf full of books that are like what I've just described, they are, if you like, the journey. They are people's recollections, they're people's, visions and things of what they've seen over the years. But that bookshelf is not complete without the Holy Grail, which is a physical piece of either an alien or an alien craft. That is the punchline that everybody's waiting for. And what I'm hoping is, it's not a massive book, it's not a big book, it's not a long read. I'm hoping the book will come out, and it's a book of very much of its time. So it's the timing is important. And I think it might be the last step before we have proper disclosure. There'll be some kind of proper disclosure coming up soon, and it's definitely the right time to put this out now. But that will complete a person's bookshelf. It'll complete the collection on UFOs. It's the punchline we've all been waiting for, hopefully.
That's incredible. And I can see you're very enthusiastic about it as well, after spearheading this research for such a long time. I mean, you're very, very into it. And I think that passion goes a really long way to really getting that truth out for people, which I love. So I want to go just a little bit into the nitty-gritty technical aspects of the actual material itself. Now, you're an archaeologist, so you probably have some fancy terminologies and ways to explain it, right? Could you, in simple terms, tell us why this particular material, especially that honeycomb-looking one, isn't standard to something else that we would find on planet Earth?
Okay, I'll give you two answers to that. The first answer is the nature in which it was found, because the finder, who was a farmer, so he just came out of his property and went out into his fields to have a look at his sheep, he described a local copse of trees that had this 25-foot wide slot, if you like, cut right through the middle of the tops of the trees. You could see where something had come down and hit these trees. And then he said 4 fields. Now in Wales, the fields are pretty big, so you're talking about a fairly large area here. He said 4 of his fields were covered, literally covered. Some of the sheets of this material are 6 foot, which is like 2 meters square, big sheets of it everywhere. And he said there were a few things that looked a bit like girders and what have you, but nothing at all that he could recognize. So, of course, he phoned the local police, he phoned the local Air Force, he phoned the local, I think, I presume he contacted the press as well at some point to try and find out what was going on and what this was all about. Well, that night, the MOD basically cleared it up. They cleaned all of it. They just took everything they could possibly get their hands on. Now, the big question, the really big question, which is what the chaps that recovered the fragments had to say, is what vehicle on planet Earth can smack into a row of trees, lose that amount of material, and then still fly off? That's the kicker. So you've got no structure, no pilots, no engines, nothing. So you've got enough debris there to build a fairly sizable craft, but whatever it was still flew off. It wasn't there. So right at the very beginning, right at the outset, you have this enormous question, which is, where on earth did this stuff come from? So then you've got the initial analysis. This is the second answer. Basically, each fragment, the top of it, which you described as honeycomb, is like a sort of green rubbery substance, and that's bonded to the metal with a grey resin. There's a very fine layer of this grey resin that bonds that on. And then you've got the metal itself. And then on the other side of the metal, you've got this kind of rough green coating that looks a bit like paint. Well, when they did the analysis, they headed straight for the metal. And as I said to you, the metallurgical analysis we had done, which was actually informally, it was done at British Aerospace. They won't mind me saying that. So that's about as high as you can go, really. But because it was informal, they produced a report, but they couldn't go into great detail. And they said, right, we know what the metal is. It's a pure alloy of duralumin. Now, in 1983, when this thing occurred, a pure alloy of duralumin was totally unknown. completely unknown. It's used now, 25 plus years later. It's used in fighter aircraft. It's used on the ailerons, the control surfaces that tell the plane where to go. So we've got it now, but we didn't have it in 1983. And then here comes the kicker. They had a look at the resin, and they said, well, we know what the resin's kind of composed of, some of the elements, because obviously we can look at it at an elemental level, but we couldn't tell you what it is. And the green rubbery substance, they said, same again, we can't tell you what that is. All we can tell you is there's a possibility it might be conductive, but we can't even be certain about that. And they said, and the paint, which looks like it's supposed to be on the outside of whatever this thing is, they said the paint is not actually aerodynamic. They said, so it doesn't come off anything that we know that flies. So at that point, we're scratching our heads thinking, okay, you've got 4 substances, one of which shouldn't exist, 2 of which they can't identify, and another one which shouldn't even be on it as a flying vehicle. So what are we looking at? What on earth is this? So I think the next step, moving forward, is to try and have it looked at again. I believe MUFON in the States have just got a new laboratory. They've just opened up a new lab for looking at things like this. There's also 1 or 2 labs over on your neck of the woods in Australia that would be keen to have a look at this material. So basically watch this space. As soon as the book comes out, we're going to have another go and see if we can make sense of this. But basically, it shouldn't have appeared the way it did. It shouldn't have existed in 1983. And the combination of the 4 layers together just don't make any sense to anybody, So it remains to this day a mysterious material. We still have no idea what it is. Haven't really got a clue. I can guess how. God, I was going to say I can guess how it was used, because that foil, that foil, what they seem to do is they seem to have a layer of what I've just described. So basically, you've got the green paint, the metal, the resin, and then this rubbery stuff. The rubbery stuff seems to stick to the foil. So that's your first layer. And then when you get to the top of the foil, because the foil's a couple of inches thick, it repeats. You've got the rubbery stuff again, you've got the resin, you've got the metal, you've got the paint. So what you've then done is you've created a sandwich effect, which then gives you a solid structure that weighs virtually nothing and carries the potential for signals of different kinds to be sent down those hexagons. You've basically got a shell that acts as a giant circuit. It's like a huge circuit of some kind. That's how we kind of piece the bits back together and conjectured they were used. But certainly the thin bits, if you just get the thin bits of metal, you can stamp on it, you can, bang it with a hammer, you can try and saw it and cut it. It is so hard to do that. It's nigh on impossible. But you can get a pair of pliers and very carefully you can snap it. So it's designed to work under pressure under certain circumstances. But when it hit the trees, it was like an eggshell. It was like boom, 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 boom. And it's just punched all this material off because it's going slow. It's not doing whatever it is it was designed to do. That's what we think has happened, has brought all these bits down. So it's fascinating. What an incredible case.
Yes, very, very interesting. So after all of the research and the story and all the investigations that you've done, what conclusion does your book come to about this material that you found?
It's a bit like the original documentary. When we filmed it, we didn't sort of wrap it up at the end with some, fancy conclusion. The finder, the guy that actually found the material, we interview him on there, and he basically says it remains to this day that this material came from an unidentified flying object. And that's the punchline. That's where he concludes. So the book at this point does the same thing. We are absolutely 110% positive that this material is part of that corpus of material that is, attributed to UFOs the world over. Other stuff has cropped up in the last 20, 25 years that's very similar to what we've got. So it's part of that. There's no doubt about that at all. But whatever it was that it came off remains unidentified. We can't sort of say, yeah, it's a drone or it's a stealth bomber or it's a satellite. None of that fits, and it doesn't fit the circumstances of the crash. And there's enough people that have seen the documentary and sort of read the pre-release copies of the book, and they've all said the same thing. You know, it doesn't come to a single individual punchline. So hopefully, if we do some analysis in the future, we might answer some of those questions. Like a lot of the books I write, it doesn't have a comfortable sort of Walt Disney type ending. You know, it's, you know, the good guys don't always win, and they don't always get the princess. You know, it doesn't quite work that way.
But that's okay. That's okay. You know, it's factual. And I think that's what's so great about a lot of this research is like people are being very objective about it, and they're not putting their opinions to try and make it fit the narrative or try and force it into some idea or opinion that it may or may not be. And sometimes inconclusive is the best that you get. You know, I mean, in your case, it's not even inconclusive. Or what you can conclude is that it's unknown. And that in itself is a conclusion, just not the conclusion of identifying what it is. And I think that leaves then an openness for more investigation, more questions, more research, you know, and it's definitely like a great foundational step for then other things to come in later on down the track and build on top of what you guys have done. So
I mean, it was quite good when we came to do the DVD. We did a reconstruction because we had enough information to say that this thing was, you know, about 25 foot wide. It took the top of the trees off, and it, you know, it flew off. So basically, you've got this amorphous kind of disc-shaped thing that we just plow through a load of trees, which we did as a reconstruction. That's about as far as you can go. You know, we can't go any further than that.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. All right, so I want to switch gears a little bit now to talk about some of the work that you did with the ancient alien side of things.
Yeah.
Now, there's been a couple of recent crop circles that have popped up in the UK. Are you familiar with those?
Yes, I do. I do follow them. I follow what comes up online and what have you.
So there was one that kind of looked like a sun. Did you see that one?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting journey for anybody that wants to get involved in crop circles. Well, let's throw the thing completely open. I think that a majority of them, especially the really complex ones, I don't think there's any doubt that they're coming from somewhere else. I think they are the real deal, as it were. But then it's also known that we're actually pretty good at producing them ourselves, because there's a lot of crop circles, especially in recent times. Some have been done deliberately. There was one in a farm in the States where they were promoting corn on the cob, and they did this huge crop circle that was all made up of pieces of corn on the cob. You know, that was all in the design.
Well, that was a promotion.
Well, yeah, the Americans as well, when they had the election, I think it was the President Trump election, they did a few crop circles with, you know, Trump and Obama and various other bits and bobs. The Chinese are whiz at it. They've done dragons, they've done all sorts of things. So it's not beyond the possibilities that we can do them. So I would say you've got to really, again, dig into the science. You have to look at the science if you want to know if they're real or not. If they're man-made, I mean, everybody will say this, that the stalks of the crop are generally scraped. You know, you can find scrape marks on them, so you know that they've been done using boards and ropes and whatever else.
Right? Like generally with the made ones, the crops are damaged, whereas with the other ones, they have this interesting way of bending it without actually destroying the crop, which I find very fascinating.
It's the nodes, the joints in the crop seem to buckle, and it causes it to bend, which actually leads me nicely into a story about, I don't think they'll mind me telling you this, the Ancient Aliens boys, because I'm sat in London, I'm sat in, like, you know, the whatever it is, library of the National History Museum or wherever we were, filming away, cameras rolling, and they sent me this piece of footage, and they said, can you comment? You know, the producers over in the States, and he's saying, can you comment on this piece of footage? And there's 9 lights going, slowly moving across this field in Wiltshire. So I just kind of looked at him and I went, no, I can't. And he's like, what do you mean, no, you can't? I said, well, I know exactly what those are. I said, we know over here that actually they're Chinese lanterns. They're trapped in the heat that's rising from the fields. And that, I said, so you can't even put that on your show. I said, because everybody knows what they are. I said, but, and this is the kicker, but back in the early 1990s, some ufologists that were out trying to film UFOs, you know, in that area, spotted a sort of gold disc going across a cornfield. So what they did was they realigned the cameras, they filmed this gold disc, and it whizzes round this cornfield back and two, and you see the corn drop. So you've actually got footage of a crop circle being formed. So this guy in the States said, right, leave it to us, you know, we'll go and find that. And sure enough, in that program, the crop circles one, you actually have that footage. It's not particularly good footage, but it's there. You see this gold disc whiz around and you see the crop drop underneath it. So that's the real side of it. You're looking now at the real side. And of course, there are electrical anomalies in these circles as well. And they tend to impress the ground so that subsequent crops bring them back. So there's something going on there. So again, it's like a lot of things, you know, you've got the real deal and then you've got people cashing in and it's not the real deal. And that seems to be common. I run across that a great deal, especially in archaeology. There's loads of people trying to copy the real thing out there.
Wow. I mean, so I'm still trying to get my head around this one. So you actually had a drone capture a gold disc flying around and the crop dropped on its own?
Yes, I believe it was filmed in 1990 or 1991. And the circumstances were, because I spoke to the guys that filmed it, they had a small group of people with cameras back then, because they were video cameras. They had them mounted on tripods. So it wasn't done with a drone.
Oh,
they
not
had,
a drone. Okay.
No, they had a row of cameras, and all these cameras are pointing up towards the sky. And it's just starting to go dark. So it's in twilight. And as they're pointing at the sky, somebody said, hang on a minute, we've got something going on in this field in front of us. So a couple of the guys tipped the cameras down and turned them to film this ball, this gold ball in the field. And they actually caught it whizzing back and to, dropping the crop to produce the crop circle. And then it whizzed off, flies off into the sky. But it's just being in the right place at the right time. Just look, you know. There was a similar thing happened actually not far from Stonehenge. There's this massive swirly, I think it's 92 circle, curly one that's very famous. And that appeared next to, I mean, Stonehenge over here is a massive tourist attraction. There are thousands of people swarming all over Stonehenge when it's open during the day. And one summer...
myself. Yeah, I visited. It's amazing.
It is. It's wonderful. So one summer, when this place is absolutely full of people, the field next door, within 20 minutes, in a very tiny time slot, this enormous pattern of circles just appear out of nowhere. So there's no way that, you know, two blokes with a board and a length of rope are going to be able to produce that. That's just impossible. It can't be done. So that's another one that's clearly genuine, because witnesses saw nothing. 1 minute there's a field and the next minute it's full of crop circles.
Yeah, that's wild. And you mentioned the electrical anomalies as well. What do you know about that?
Well, there was quite a lot of books written about that in the early 90s. There was a brilliant one in 1996 looking at the electrical fields and the magnetic anomalies that you find in crop circles. The first instinct of the investigators obviously was to take, you know, actual scientific gear in there and monitor these things and have a look at them and see what was going on. Obviously there was a bit of a fear of radiation as well, so they checked that out, and as a rule it doesn't affect the background radiation at all, but it does affect the electrical and the magnetic effects that you get naturally from the soils underneath. They looked at it in quite a great deal of detail. I mean, I'm not going to go into the science of it, but they did discover that within these circles there is this electrical vortex effect that seems to follow the shape of the circle. So if it swirls clockwise, then the energy seems to be going in that direction. If it's anti-clockwise, it's the same going, you know, if it's a cross, it seems to be lateral and so on, which is invisible. Of course, you'd need the gear to be able to go and check that out. So whatever it is that whizzes round and produces these patterns certainly leaves some kind of physical, electrical, magnetic trace behind it, which again, like I say, it pops up the following year as well. The pattern will come up, you know, for quite a few years in the subsequent crops, even though the farmers are ploughing the fields. You know, the crops then pop up and they all grow to different heights, and which is what we do as archaeologists. We look at the magnetism in the ground in terms of shapes, you know, because it affects the greenery, it affects the way that plants grow. So that was my interest. I was looking at it to say, okay, how can this, if this is man-made, why is it coming back the following year and then the year after that and then the year after that? So clearly there is the ground itself, the physical soil is affected by what's taking place. And the changes then are reflected in what's grown over the top. You know, if you have a crop of...
It's just mind-boggling. And I was chatting with someone else about this earlier today as well, that apparently the seeds from that particular crop, the ones that have been affected, apparently they grow better the following season.
Yeah, they do. They do. If you look at the differences, that's one of the big differences. The classic is if you have let's say you have a shape in a field, and it's growing, let's say, wheat, and then the next year the farmer decides to leave the field fallow, so he sows it with grass. Now, for an archaeologist, grass is brilliant. Grass will tell you whatever's underneath it, what's going on. And as you rightly say, the pattern will come back, but it's in the green grass, it's in the healthy grass, and the grass is longer, so it's a darker color. It changes the color of the grass. So clearly that's done something on a physiological level. It's changed the nature of that field.
Soil then? Is something happening in the soil, or is something happening? I mean,
no, it's just
that.
Do you know, I'm not sure anybody really knows. It just grows better. It leaves a trace that enables things to grow. So, I mean, it's a bit daft, really, because when you start getting down to molecular levels, things that we think of as being quite negative, like electricity, obviously will kill us if we get involved. And there's this big environmental thing now about CO2 and all the rest of it. Plants are very different. They seem to thrive on, the electrical components of the planet, what's going on in the atmosphere electrically. They seem to thrive on that, and of course they need CO to exist. That's what trees and plants use to improve. So it's going to be something environmental, there's no doubt about it, and something that we don't fully understand yet. I don't think we grasp what's going on there. Other than the fact, like I say, CO2 makes crops grow better. So if you've got things in greenhouses, you pump CO2 into a greenhouse, it'll thrive, because the plants are trying to process that. They're trying harder. So actually, some of the things we regard as negative in nature are not negative at all. They're there as part of the way things work.
Well, that's the beautiful synergy between man and nature, right? Which I think is a big part of the evolution. And I mean, a lot of this ties into consciousness studies and actually disclosure as well, because I think the evolution and the harmony between people and the planet is actually a very vital component towards opening up to, these other dimensional beings. I just think it's all kind of interconnected in that way,
Yeah, I can't wait till one of them actually decides that they're going to pop out and appear, because I think we're going to get a bit of a kicking, because we have this idea we dominate. We dominate. We dominate the planet. We control it. Yeah. We force our will on it. And these guys are going to appear and they're going to say, "Hang on a minute, no, that's not how you do it. It's the other way around. You understand the planet and you work with it." So that's the page I'm on.
This is exactly what the indigenous people have been saying for such a long time, I mean, here in Australia, it's quite commonly known that the Australian indigenous peoples, they will always say that we don't own the land, we are a custodian of the land. And I think it's such a beautiful principle, because it brings in that harmony, it brings in that connectedness versus, like other sort of Western culture, which is like, I'm going to trample over everything and build what I want, where I want. And it's all about me. And, I think this is one of the things I've spoken about in previous episodes as well, where we think we're the apex predator of the planet and we think that we own everything. And suddenly these ETs are going to come and be like, oh, yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I think it's really going to put humanity in its place,
Yeah, can you imagine that? They sort of pop out and they go, okay, you're living in this dimension, but, what about the other 50 dimensions? What about this? Exactly. What about that? What about the other? We know for a fact that, our frequency range, what we can see and what we can hear and what we're experiencing, that comes to an end fairly quickly, and there are beyond that animals alive that live in other frequencies. Cats and dogs can see and hear things we can't hear, just on a basic level. And then somewhere down the end of that road you end up with something like the dolphin that has two brains. It's like, wow. And then that is teaching us that there is other consciousness out there that just doesn't function like we do. So who knows what we can't see. That's
you
another.
Mentioned that there's this concept of other dimensions. I'm curious from your research what you've discovered on that.
Well, very early on, a long time ago, I was a huge fan of people like Tesla. I've looked at Einstein and one or two other folks, what have you, a lot of the science community, without getting too sort of detailed. Even the French medieval prophet Nostradamus said, when we get to the 21st century, the key, if you like, will exist in wavelength and light. And they were all saying the same thing. As soon as science began to catch up on this idea, that there is more, that everything is, function. It's all a wavelength. Everything's a wavelength. If it's solid, or it's, liquid, or it's gas, or it's light, or it's electric, or they're all different wavelengths. That's all they are. Being a drummer as well, obviously, sound is a wavelength. And all of them were arguing, basically, early in the 20th century, that we don't get it. We don't grasp how this functions. And there have been a few people, like Tesla, who messed about with it and discovered you can send electricity, from one place to another without needing to connect it, and you can focus it. And then I had an interview the other day, and some guys really got into the Coral Castle in America, how this fella in the 1920s, 1930s was lifting, 40-ton blocks and moving them, but he would do it at night and he wouldn't tell anybody how he did it. So they've worked out from some of the gear he left behind when he passed away that he seemed to be doing it using vibration, using wavelength and frequency. So, you can't, even being an archaeologist, you can't dodge it. Somebody comes along and goes, hey, there's a temple at Baalbek and there's a 160-ton block about 80 foot up the wall. How did they put that there? So as an archaeologist, I'm kind of duty bound to try and work that one out, and that just, that extends right across the planet. You look at the pyramids, you look at anything that's called a cyclopean structure, anything that's huge. Stonehenge is another example. Anything that gets beyond, 10, 15 tons, it's beyond anything that we can deal with now. But clearly these guys, all over the planet, they're just running around going, well, let's build a pyramid here. Wallop, up it goes with, 60, 70, 80, 90-ton blocks. They just, whatever they wanted to do, they just pick it up and move it. And we're looking at this thinking, hang on a minute, I went to Egypt, and Ramesses was famous for sticking up these enormous 35, 40 foot tall statues. And I stood next to one of those, and I just, looked at it and thought, two problems. One, it's made of one piece. So how the heck did they get that carved? And of course, the obvious one, the second one, is how did they move it? It's got to have something to do with frequency. It's arguable. Archaeologists come out with all kinds of twaddle in the past, like, well, they floated them down the River Nile. Well, yeah, maybe they did, but that's still a frequency. You still have to understand what water will support and how that functions, so they did sort of, in a sense, you could say, well, they flew it on frequency and they flew it down there. But if they could do that on water with something that size, what else could they do? Could they do it on vibration? Could they do it on sound? Could they use air? Could they use the power of the planet to do it? So you're off into that kind of territory with stuff like that. But the idea, that they have sand ramps, they've got like a 40-ton block rolling up a sand ramp in 90, 100-degree temperatures, that sand's just going to go, it's going to, and the block's going to sink. It's just physically impossible. As an engineering feat, it can't be done. So you've got a huge number of unanswered questions there, which I've followed over the years. Eric von Daniken got me interested in the 1960s because my dad had his book on his shelf, and I've followed that as well, which is probably how I've finished up on Ancient Aliens, because Eric's on there as well. So it's kind of, it's a thread. So, as an archaeologist, it's, there's so many unanswered questions, which brackets everything we've talked about, crop circles, UFOs. That's the unanswered questions.
Yeah, we still have this whole sort of, I guess, unanswered avenue when it comes to what is frequency, what is vibration, how does it work, how do the dimensions play into that? There are some scientists out there now that are, really heavy into string theory, and they're saying things like there's 13 dimensions in this universe, and I don't know what actually number they're up to now, but I think there's at least 13, So it's getting more and more kind of knowledgeable that these different avenues exist. But I think, it's interesting. I think sometimes this is where I feel like the crossover between science and spirituality really needs to be a little bit more intertwined, because I came through all of this through spirituality. So I was meditating day after day after day after day, and then discovered UFOs and aliens and all, consciousnesses and all this other stuff. And I was able to then bring that consciousness, merge it with a third dimensional reality experience, like physical sightings, beams of light, those sorts of things. But it's still, there's still a lot out there that people are investigating. And sometimes I wonder if people are maybe looking at it through the wrong lens, because I think the monks out there probably knew a lot of this stuff. And if the ancient Egyptians were able to build pyramids using vibration, where did they get that knowledge from? How did they have those technologies? Where, how did they learn some of these things? And I think those are the questions that are very much unanswered. But also, I think the people that are looking into it might not necessarily always be looking at it with the right frame or the right lens, because they're wanting that hard physical evidence. But I think consciousness plays such a big role in all of this, because that is, for me, how the connections have happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head from a historical point of view. If you go back to medieval times, all the medievalists out there will know this, the idea that things are in levels, layers, like the 7th heaven and the 13th heaven and the so on and so on. They just referred to it in spiritual terms. Now we're starting to come up with exactly the same thing, but in scientific terms. Really? So, yeah, I mean, I see it because obviously I've studied history. So I could pull out all kinds of diagrams from medieval manuscripts that show you all these different levels. Usually they have hell in the middle and heaven on the outside, but they have a number of levels, a number of layers. And very often they come in the form of a vision. So you're on exactly the right page. Like you say, you've got these little guys in monasteries here, there and everywhere, and they see this concept as a picture and then reproduce it, and it comes up as levels. But you've also got people, sat in France with the Hadron Collider that are, throwing protons and neutrons and all this around, and they're saying the same thing. They're saying, oh, look, this is leading us, out of this layer into the next layer, and then so on and so on and so on. But then in terms of where the information comes from, that's quite interesting, because one of the other books I mentioned that I did with Philip is that one, Crystal Skulls and Human Heads. That was the first one I did for Philip at Flying Disc Press. This one's interesting because I put forward the suggestion that we started off, as it were, with all this knowledge. Right at the beginning, when we started out, we were essentially a form of perfect race, perfect beings on a perfect world. And that rather than the idea of evolving, so, hey, everything's getting better, the book actually says it's the opposite. Everything's getting worse, because that's what the evidence points to. It points to catastrophe, cataclysm, flood, meteorite impact, you name it. And each time something goes wrong, at the end of it, you finish up with less than you had before. So what we're struggling with is, as you rightly say, we've got all this stuff with information that's come from somewhere, but most people think we're getting better. So that creates that mystery. But if it's the other way around, if we're actually getting worse, if we had it all and we knew it all to begin with, and then we're devolving, then all of a sudden it makes sense. Because we are literally the ants, running across the back of this enormous planet. And the super beings are not with us anymore. They've all gone. They disappeared in the distant past. So that's another part of this ancient aliens ethos that I'm quite firmly on the same page as, is this idea that things...
I disagree with that. When it comes to this de-evolution, I mean, that fits in with a lot of the narratives in spiritual communities. For example, we talk about ancient Lemuria, Atlantis, the ancient civilizations where they did know a lot more. They did have access to technologies. Of course, it begs the question of why. And also, I am a strong believer in the idea that we have gotten pretty bad, but also it's onward and upward from here. Because I think the disclosure movement is how we get out of this. And one thing that I do know is planets or civilizations go through phases of evolution, devolution all the time. It's constantly in flux, right? And once you get to that sort of bottom, which I feel like we're at now, I mean, you think about it, it's pretty bad. Like, short of annihilation of the planet and complete climate catastrophe, we're not exactly doing great, So I feel like we have actually hit the bottom of the barrel. I hope it doesn't get too much worse from here, because I think that would be really bad. And I'm optimistic that from here it is onwards and upwards. But I definitely don't disagree with this idea that we started off much better off hundreds of thousands of years ago, have actually gotten worse. And now we're going on the up again to try and evolve. The only thing that I guess sort of, I don't know if concern is the right word, but I sort of keep an eye on is the whole movement with AI and transhumanism. Because if we go further down that, the organic capacity for human life is going to be very much impacted by that. And I personally don't think any of that's a good thing. Like, I think that would
No.
be very detrimental to us as a human race, even though, you know, people are framing it from the perspective of like being able to have longevity of life and have, you know, medical solutions. And there's certainly some valid points in all of that. But where is the organic human evolution and consciousness when you replace everything with artificial intelligence and robots? You know, so
Well,
I think that is the potential only worst way that we can go.
well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's several reasons why you're absolutely right. I mean, that's our attempt as human beings to try and fight against the decay that we see, because that's all that AI can do. It can only improve things if things are getting worse. You know, that's our attempt to fight against nature that is effectively fighting against us, which is what tells us that we're going about things the wrong way. So you're absolutely right there, absolutely right. And again, you know, it only takes a massive solar flare or, you know, a decent sized asteroid or, you know, comet to go past, and all that AI is going to be useless. It'll just get burnt out because we're not functioning with nature. We're not understanding how the forces around us affect what's going on. I mean, silicon chips and all the rest of it, what we're talking on now, these computers and that, one decent sized solar flare, the lot's gone. You know, it's had it. So you can't put your reliance in mechanical, physical devices, etc. And history teaches you that. If you have a look at some of the big civilizations, they peaked at some enormous technological advances for the time, but still, as you say, went over the edge, you know, fell off the edge of what they were doing, and it still went down. And the question is, as you say, if we do rely on things like that, when the down comes, which it inevitably will, what are the consequences? You know, we're not going to survive if we put our reliance on invisible things like AI and, you know, pieces of machinery. It's historically doesn't work. It's never worked for the human race. On the other hand, you know, a lot of what we do is this. It's actually fear of dimensions, because sooner or later, none of us are going to be here anyway. Nobody gets out of here alive, you know. And as soon as that happens, you're out of this dimension and you're off doing that journey. You know, you're on that journey. So it's that fear of the dimensions that we should be trying to understand. It's that fear that's causing a lot of what we see to happen and the way people are reacting to that. I do actually, that book isn't as pessimistic as I made it sound, actually. It does finish on an up note, so we are on the same page there. You know, it does say pull your act together and, you know, let's get on with sorting this place out.
Yeah, well, I think that's again, that's a very common thread and a very common conversation I'm having throughout this series as well. And you know, one of my reasons for creating this particular show was to give people hope. It's not to go around and just analyze things. And I mean, we do a bit of analysis on the show as well, but it's really, you know, that A, disclosure is in our own hands, and B, we have the power to shift our consciousness, and not only for ourselves and for our own benefit, but for the entire planet and you know, the ripple effect that has on the multiverse. We can lift ourselves out of this. So really the whole conversation is around the shift in consciousness and an elevation of our, you know, I guess, capacity to be human, really, to really take responsibility for what we've created, and then to go, well, hang on, we've created this, so we can uncreate it, or maybe we can create something else. And I think that's really where the conversation needs to go.
Yeah, power for change. We need change. There's I mean, a great example over here is wind farms, you know, these great, huge, like windmills that generate electricity, which on the surface, everybody was like, yeah, fantastic. You know, it's free energy from wind. Whoa, hang on a minute. Over here, they've destroyed a lot of environments by building the wind farms, you know, and they can't do anything with them when they become obsolete. They just have to bury them. And they're still putting all that electricity into batteries. So by the time we finish, when you actually look at that, yeah, it looked great. It was a great idea at the time, but it's an environmental disaster. It doesn't work. It's us trying to use technology, you know, it just wasn't done right. So that's a really good modern day 21st century example of us trying to solve a problem, but actually making it worse. So, you know, maybe, you know, Winston Churchill, one of our prime ministers, said, the further you look back, the further forward you can see. So we need to be looking back to our old technologies and our ancient races and, you know, what they did in the past in terms of how they dealt with things. That's where the answer lies. You know, it's not, the answer's not in technology. Like you say, that's not where the answer lies.
Yeah, such a powerful reminder. I mean, I would say it's safe to say that most people ultimately want the same thing. We want humanity to thrive. We want there to be harmony. We want to look after the planet. But I think there's a lot of debate still around how to do that. What's the best way to do that? Because there are people that will fight tooth and nail and say, yes, AI is the way. You know, that is the way for salvation. And you know, then there are people like myself that are like, well, actually, no, I think it's in the human consciousness, and that we don't need to rely on these different external things. I mean, just to like, I mean, I have a lot of experience with meditation, you know, consciousness, those sorts of things. And like, I've had telepathic experiences with people where like, we'll literally have shared experiences where multiple people in a room will see or experience or hear the same sorts of things, or I'll have communications with certain people like on those sorts of like wavelengths, like you said, you know, and it's just, it's a different way of operating in frequency. And then what happens is when we utilize technology, for example, like we use telephones these days, I think the introduction of the telephone actually reduced our capacity to be innately telepathic, which I do believe is a skill that all humans have. And then you bring in things like the internet. Well, then why do you need to go out and tap into the collective consciousness and do things like channeling when everything is at your fingertips on a computer? And so I think the introduction of technology has actually made us dumber.
It has.
Because I think our innate capacity connect with the world around us and people, it's already there. It's something that is inbuilt into the human, like, you know, we are the intelligent race here on this planet, and yet we're realizing everything. We're using phones to communicate instead of telepathy. We're using, you know, the internet instead of just tapping into the universal wisdom. And I think that is part of the de-evolution. And the solution to that, in my opinion, involves us actually reconnecting with ourselves, reconnecting with nature, reconnecting with these multidimensional beings, aliens, you know, reopening those connections so that we can evolve as a race. And I guess, you know, for me, it just seems very like straightforward. Like that's, you know, it seems simple in my mind. I wish I could just, you know, show everyone that.
If what we need to do basically is get out there into the world and just connect. You know, it really is that simple. We need to connect. And that's what people did in the past, you know, right up until probably just after the Second World War. People were still out there on the land, working in the land, working with each other, you know, and that's what we need to do. We need to get out there and just connect, and not, like you say, focus solely on technology, you know, which is, I suppose, what we're doing now. But, you know, this is not the future of mankind. The irony. It's not the future of mankind, not by any means. And all that I learned and all the experiences I've had over the years, you know, of mostly they've been out there, you know. Yes, you can do the background research and all the rest of it. It's a great tool for all that. But I've still got 10,500 books in my library, and I rely more on them than I do on, you know, things like Google and what have you. I don't rely on that. Which again is ironic, because if anyone wants to buy me books, they're going to have to go and find them on Amazon, you know.
Exactly. That's
so,
right.
Especially if they live in Australia, that's the only way you're going to be able to get them, really. So, you know, it's ironic, isn't it? So
it is. I know. It's just sometimes you gotta always laugh at this reality that we've created. I mean, I have an appreciation, you know, for the cosmic joke. It's like it seems so simple to me how we can change things, and yet at the same time it's like, this is where we're at. And sometimes you have to kind of just embrace it for a while as well, but also knowing that there is an evolution happening, there is a shift in consciousness that's happening. I think UFOs, UAPs, disclosure, ETs, I think they all play a really big role in that, because I mean, in my experience, a lot of them want to help us. So, you know, these crop circles, they're coming in and they're showing us that. They're actually showing us, then they're not destroying the crop. They're showing us symbols and messages, and what energy they're putting into the ground there is actually assisting. It's helping. It's growing the crops. And that says to me that there's a really beautiful opportunity for benevolent connections with whoever it is that's doing these, because they're obviously not harming us. And if they wanted to annihilate us, they probably would have done that a long time ago. So I think we're safe.
About 10 or 15 years ago, there were a couple of crop circles that contained things we could actually translate. There was a couple in certain type of wordage, and there was one, I think, in binary. And the upshot of it is they were basically saying in a message, you guys need to get your act together. You really need to sort yourselves out. That was the gist of the messages. And they were all the same. They all came over different years. And it was just saying, look, if you don't get your act together, your future's, you know, pretty dark. So you're absolutely on the money again. Yeah, the crop circles are, I think that's the message behind them. I think they're saying, there are beings out here, we are capable of doing things you can't do. We're bigger than you in many respects, but, you are in charge. This is your dimension, your planet, your world, and you really are going to have to get your act together and sort it out, or the future won't be bright, and that's the gist of what they've been saying.
Oh, powerful. I think that's a great note to end on, a beautiful message for people.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
To remind ourselves that, yes, we need to get our act together, but yes, we also have the power to do that. And I think that is the most important message that we can give people right now. Mark, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been such a pleasure. Your energy is so vibrant. It's been a very uplifting conversation.
Thank you.
So I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to First Contact. I'm your host Eesha Patel, and I'm so excited to have this conversation about open contact with extraterrestrial beings. Come join me in the Facebook community where you can continue the discussion, or keep listening for another episode of First Contact.